name's Ann Zimmerman. I'm the Vice President of the Salina League of Women Voters. Our President, Lori Troe, can't come today, and so I'm introducing our speaker. But first, let me say that the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization of volunteers that are both men and women. We work to increase public participation in the governmental process, and we have 9 leagues across the state of Kansas and 1,200 local leagues across the nation. We work to promote citizen action on local, state, and national issues. We also want to say that October 16th, which is coming right up, is the deadline for registering to vote. So if you haven't registered to vote, including the people watching on our video, remember you can go to ksvotes.org on your phone, on your computer, ksvotes.org, and you can register right there to vote. No problem, easy as can be. Or you can go to the county clerk's office and do it there. So our next election is, of course, the general election, an important election. So we really hope that everybody who's registered to vote will come out to vote at that point. So today our topic is foster care in Kansas, and we looked for someone across the state who had some expertise in that area, and we found Bennett Magnuson. Is that how you say your name?
That is.
Oh, I'm so happy. From Kansas Appleseed, which is a not-for-profit organization. I'm sure he'll give you a little more about that. But let's welcome Bennett Magnuson. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Ann, and thanks also to the League of Women Voters for hosting these Lunch and Learns and for all the work that you do to promote civic engagement and voting in Kansas. It's obviously critically important. Before we get started, does everybody have a copy of the handout? They're off to the side. Go ahead. A lot of the information that's in that handout is also covered in this slide, but there's some information on there that's not in the slides and vice versa. So please do take a copy and take it with you. Let me know if you have any questions about the information in the handout. But yeah, good afternoon, and thank you for coming out on a very rainy day. I drove from Lawrence, and I-70 is not rain friendly. A lot of mud happening along the way, but I'm glad to be here. And excited that there are so many people who are interested in the topic of foster care in Kansas, because as we'll talk about a little later, the system really is in crisis right now, and we've got literally thousands of kids in foster care, many of whom are facing pretty dangerous situations and situations that aren't good for their well-being in the moment and for long-term, with lifelong consequences. So before I jump into the slides here, since we are a good-sized group, I'm wondering if we could go around and quickly do introductions, maybe your name and what connection you have to this issue that brought you here today. Can we start with you?
Randall Hurdy, State Senate.
Thank you.
Carmen Wilson, League of Women Voters member.
Ron Kramer, I'm a pastor. I'm just interested in foster care and child issues.
Jason Dietz, a reporter for the Salina Journal.
Charlene Crowley, retired social worker. I'm currently the mother of a single foster home mother.
Great. Thanks for being here.
I'm David Nolan. I'm League Women Voters Membership Chair.
Carol Beyer, I'm a court-appointed special advocate.
Thanks for being here.
Ann Zimmerman, Vice President of the League of Women Voters.
Dexter Eggers, I'm interested in the topic. I'm Tim Muldool, a retired pastor, and interested in all the things that all the good causes that we can be a part of.
Thank you.
Stephen Drawings, retired here in Salina.
So yeah, it sounds like we've got a lot of expertise in the room and from a lot of different perspectives. That's great. I will say that we've been hosting some community forums across the state, from Garden City to Pittsburgh to Johnson County. And at those community conversations, we've similarly had a really great diverse group of people, and I think that makes the conversation really rich to have educators and policymakers and community members in the room to talk about these really important issues from a lot of different perspectives. So as Ann mentioned, I'm the Executive Director for the Kansas Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. Kansas Appleseed is a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization dedicated to building up thriving, inclusive, and just communities. So that means we work on a pretty broad range of issues. When it comes to thriving communities, that's a lot of work like childhood hunger, healthcare, housing is an emerging issue for us. When we talk about inclusive communities, that's a lot of work around voter engagement. We actually are partnering with the League of Women Voters in Southeast Kansas to increase voter registration, voter turnout in that part of the state, as well as advocacy around immigration issues and racial justice issues. And then finally, when we talk about just communities, we mean that every Kansan should benefit from a fair and effective judicial system. So that's a range of projects, all of which touch on the courts in some way. Everything from juvenile justice, criminal justice reform, issues around judicial independence, judicial funding, and obviously the topic for today, foster care. There's a lot that goes into foster care, but it is ultimately controlled by the court system. And as an organization that was born out of the legal community, we feel like we have a special responsibility to be advocating for a fair and effective judicial system that really does benefit everyone in our state. In addition to being the executive director for Kansas Appleseed and the broad range of projects we work on, we're also one of the founding steering committee members for a coalition that started at the beginning of this year called Strengthen Families, Rebuild Hope. If you're interested in learning more, you can go to rebuildhopekansas.org. That's the website for the coalition. On the website, you can see all the steering committee members. It's a pretty broad range of organizations and former foster youth who are interested in coming together and speaking up on this issue. One criteria that we did have when we started the coalition for the steering committee was that all the organizations that are involved at that level of leadership in the coalition not receive DCF funding. And the reason for that was a fewfold. One, there actually weren't a lot of opportunities for people who weren't receiving DCF funding to join the conversation, and we know that, as evidenced by this room, there's a lot of interest in the community from people and organizations who aren't in the system receiving DCF funding. And the second was that we just wanted to make sure that we could remain an independent voice and that we wouldn't be putting any of our members in a potential conflict of interest situation where they were concerned about speaking out on an issue because of the potential implications for their funding from the state. But again, rebuildhopekansas.org. You can see the steering committee members as well as some of our other materials. I also wanted to highlight that we do have 4 former foster youth on our steering committee, and it's been a really valuable experience getting to work with them, especially in that leadership role, and they've been invaluable in guiding the work of the coalition. So as I mentioned, we came together at the beginning of 2018 over this concern about the foster care crisis. I'll go into more detail in a moment, but around basically the questions of how did Kansas get here and how can we get out from this crisis situation. Goals for today. I do have some information to share. It'll be pretty familiar information for some of you. Some of you it might be new information, I hope. But as it also says here, really my goal in sharing this information is that we can have some shared stats and facts and information to be the foundation for a conversation today. As I mentioned, we've been hosting these community forums across the state. The discussions that have come out of those have been very rich and very helpful for us in guiding our advocacy. So I'm hoping to save a significant amount of time at the end to talk through some questions that we have, but also please, as I'm going through this, interrupt, let me know what seems right to you, and also areas where you think we've got it wrong. That'd be really important. Again, I know there are a lot of experts in this room, so please do interrupt. So for those of you who work in child welfare in one form or another, probably know that nationally the regulations, the statutes around child welfare and foster care really focused on three main goals. First, safety, making sure that kids are safe either at home or if that's not possible, in a safe home-like environment. Second, permanency, that kids don't sort of languish in the foster care system, but that they receive a permanent placement, either reintegration back into their birth family, or if that's not possible, a permanent adoption within an adoptive family. And third, well-being, recognition at the national level that child welfare systems are about more than just making sure a kid is safe and making sure they're in a permanent placement, but really that those kids are thriving. Because we know that generally kids who enter foster care experience incredible amounts of trauma, both before and during and after removal into foster care. We know that educational attainment, educational outcomes are far behind their peers, and it's especially serious for kids who age out of the foster care system. In fact, I just saw a stat the other day from the Kansas City area that said more than 25% of kids who age out of foster care in the Kansas City area end up in homelessness at some point. So obviously very important and ambitious goals at the federal level. And then Kansas has set similar but slightly different top three priority goals. And those are really centered around prevention, first of all, and early intervention. So you can see there from the Department for Children and Families, the number one goal is to help struggling families as early as possible, either before the DCF needs to get involved or after DCF is involved, as quickly as possible to get that family back on their feet and headed in the right direction. Again, a big part of that is measured, is evaluated by how many kids aren't successfully, families aren't successfully being supported and kids are being removed into out-of-home placement. So that's a key metric for that goal. The second one sort of mirrors the permanency portion of the federal goals there. You can see the second goal that the Department for Children and Families lays out for our child welfare system is that kids have a stable environment. And the key metric there is both number of placements that a kid goes through when they're in foster care, as well as how often kids are in the same school that they were in prior to removal into foster care. So a couple key metrics there. We'll come back to that. And then finally, in the direct parallel with the federal goal of permanency, to make sure that, as I said before, kids have a permanent placement, either preferably their birth family, if that's at all possible, again with supports to make sure that that's a safe environment where the kid can thrive. And if that's not possible, that as quickly as possible, that child be placed in a permanent adoptive setting. So again, the key metrics here in evaluating this goal are how long kids are staying in the system, how many placements they're having, and how long it takes to either be reunified back with their birth family or have a finalized adoption. So I want to go through each of these goals one by one and give you some information about where Kansas is at the moment on each of these goals. As I said, there are some key metrics that the state tracks that we can look to see how we're doing as a state. So on this first goal from the Department for Children and Families, which is again about preventing foster care removals by helping families as soon as possible to address whatever needs they're struggling with. Long story short, we're not doing well. This is a big part of what advocates are talking about when they say that our foster care system is in crisis at the moment. So this information is in your handout. This is a graph that shows how many kids are in out-of-home placements in foster care at the end of each month, and it goes up through, looks like July of 2018. It's pretty clear. All right, we had a pretty steady level of kids in out-of-home placement, hovering right around 5,000. And then starting right around 2012, we see a very sharp and very steady increase in the number of kids. To put some really specific numbers on it, at the end of June 2018, we had 7,588 kids. And again, 8 years ago, it was more around 5,000, so that's 45%, nearly a 50% increase in the number of kids who are in that status that you were talking about, who have been removed from their home but haven't yet received permanency. And you'll see it is a pretty steady and pretty sharp increase year after year, more and more kids going in. This past year, nearly 400 more kids than the year before were in that sort of limbo status of being in out-of-home placement as a child in foster care. To dig into these numbers a little bit more, to show you what's behind or what's going on beneath that, that steady rise here, these numbers, I'll read them out because they're kind of small, show first the entries, how many kids each year are being removed into the system from their birth families. Exits, how many of those kids in foster care are exiting either through adoption, reintegration, or aging out. They have just gotten older than the foster care system allows. And then finally, the average length of stay. So while they were in foster care, how long were they there? You'll see that from 8 years ago, 2010, we've had a 22% increase in the number of kids each year going into the system, but only a 14% increase in the number of exits. So it's not keeping pace. We're having more and more kids entering. We are having more kids exit, but not at the same rate. So obviously over time, if you've got a system where you've got more people coming in than are leaving, just like a room, if more people are coming in and leaving, that number is going to rise more and more. Obviously a system that is really struggling to keep up with the number of kids who are entering in. And you also see that reflected in the average length of stay. So 4 years ago, the average amount of time that a kid was in foster care was a little less than 17 months. This past fiscal year, it was just over 19 months. So about a 25% increase in the number of, or the amount of time that a kid is spending in this system. So I think taken all together, you really do see how these pieces could come together in a perfect storm sort of way to really overwhelm a system that has not been able to keep up. And as a result, kids are staying longer and we're not able to move them through the system effectively. You may have heard folks say this is a national problem and a national phenomenon, that the number of kids in foster care is going up everywhere, and that is certainly true. However, it's going up more here in Kansas than other states. We're outpacing those other states pretty significantly. So nationally, in the past, these numbers are 2016 to 2012, comparing them, so there's a little bit of lag here. But nationally, the U.S. saw a 9% increase in the number of kids in foster care, but Kansas saw a 22% increase, so more than double the rate of increase of the nation as a whole. And in addition to moving faster than the rest of the nation, we also didn't start out in a great place. So we, before this increase, we're already removing kids into foster care at a rate faster than the national average, and that's only gotten worse. So you'll see that, and these are, again, around pretty current numbers, but nationally, about 6 out of every 1,000 kids are going into foster care. Here in Kansas, it's almost double that, 11 out of every 1,000, or just over 1 out of every 100 kids in the state is in our foster care. Just one last comparison here. If you rank all 50 states, we are in the top 10 or bottom 10, I guess, depending on your perspective, for our number of kids in the foster care. We have more kids in foster care per 1,000 than 42 other states. So a pretty serious and kind of an outlier, pretty far from the norm nationally here in Kansas. If you're curious about how the state as a whole compares to Saline County, that's what these numbers are. You'll see that it's pretty much the story here as well, although Saline County has actually seen an even larger increase over the past 10 years. The raw numbers are statewide again in 2010, just about 5,000. Now about 7,500, or a 45% increase. Here in Saline County, this county has gone from 50 kids removed into foster care to over 200 kids. So that's more than a 300% increase. You'll see though that the line, although being steeper than the state as a whole, shows a similar sort of steady increase over the past few years. If that is where we are, how did we get here? And what is contributing to this? Obviously a very complex system, and it would not be accurate to point to any one contributing factor, but I do want to put out for discussion some of the contributing factors that people have talked about as they've looked into why our state is both an outlier and why we have seen such an increase over the past 8 years. One of those contributing factors that folks point to is family preservation services. So these are social services that are offered to a family after they are sort of known to the Department for Children and Families. So the Department for Children and Families knows that this family is struggling, that there are child welfare issues present in the home, but it has not yet gotten to the point where that immediately that child needs to be removed. So the idea is here's an opportunity before it reaches an immediate crisis moment with that family to work with them to overcome whatever they're struggling with, to give them the services they need to prevent removal of their children into the foster care system. The numbers I'm going to show you here sort of describe the system at each of its step around that time. So this first line here is the number of reports into the Department for Children and Families that there is a potential child welfare issue in a family. You'll see that statewide that's increased 30% since 2010, so a significant number, significantly more reports being made into the Department for Children and Families. Not quite as much of an increase here in Saline County, about half that, a 16% increase. The second line is after you take all those reports into the Department for Children and Families, they're screened, and some of them are let go and some of them are followed up on. The assigned reports, you'll see actually an identical increase, both statewide and here in Saline County, of 46%. So a higher increase in those than an increase in the number of intakes. So more of the reports in are getting assigned. And then removals, and that's the piece that we've been talking about. So after those steps, the Department for Children and Families and the court says this child needs to be taken out of the home. A 22% increase both statewide and here in Saline County. So not as much of an increase as there is in the assigned reports. But this final row that I want to show you is the number of referrals to family preservation services. Again, these are the services that are designed to help that family before it's reached the point of removal, directly tied to the Department for Children and Families' goal of helping families at the first sign of struggle to reduce the number of kids getting removed into out-of-home placements. And there's something wrong here. Because we have in the state this huge increase in reports and assignments and removals, and you would think if that's reflective of the need in these families or something going on with these families, we probably should see a similar increase in the number of referrals to these services, but in fact we've seen the opposite. So statewide, a 6% reduction in referrals to family preservation services. And here in Saline County, more than that, 11% drop in the number of families who are being referred to receive family preservation services. Okay, I might do sort of a lightning round here to show you a little bit more information, looking at the situation from a slightly different angle. So we know we have all these kids coming in, the numbers are rising, but when you look at why they're coming in, a pretty clear pattern emerges. So the information I'm going to share with you is about the primary removal reason. I did want to flag that for folks, the information here. Oftentimes there are multiple reasons that a kid is known to the child welfare system, but they report the primary. So they designate this is the main, the primary issue that led to removal. Kansas, like other states, we see that neglect is a far larger cause of removals than abuse or other reasons, which I think is maybe a little bit counterintuitive to folks, because we think of the child welfare system as there to protect against abuse, but it's really neglect that is driving it. However, again, Kansas is going in a different direction here because in addition to neglect being the primary, the most frequent primary reason that kids are removed, it is also what's really been driving the growth over the past 8 years in the number of kids. So this slide shows, I think, what we might intuitively think of when we think of the child welfare system. This dark orange line is physical or sexual abuse, which has held fairly flat. We have seen a little bit of an uptick over the past year in that category. The yellow line is around parent-child relationship, and the blue line is substance use. So going back to that question about the opioid crisis, at least from these numbers, we don't see a big spike in that. But then this dark blue line here is neglect. So all the other reasons have, for the most part, held fairly steady, but neglect has really skyrocketed here in Kansas. This is Saline County. The chart is a little bit more messy, in part because the numbers are smaller here, so you're going to see a lot more noise and things like that, but you kind of see a similar pattern emerging here. The top two lines there are neglect and parent-child relationship. The bottom two lines are substance use and physical or sexual abuse. So again, you see that they were all sort of bunched together. Physical, sexual abuse and substance use have sort of stayed flat, but back in around 2014, there's a big jump in neglect, parent-child relationship reasons for removal. And this also goes back to the question of where's this money going to come from for these services. And one great source of funding for families who are struggling with the issues that are evident in that neglect line are some of the federal safety net programs. These numbers here, and this I think also speaks to, I forget who asked about what happened in 2012. A lot of folks point to these policies specifically as driving in a causal way that increase in number of kids. So TANF is the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. This is cash assistance to families who are far below the poverty line. You can see that back in 2011, statewide, 26,000, more than 26,000 children, again, we're not talking about families, but these are specifically children, were getting resources from the TANF program. By January of this year, that number had fallen to 7,000. So a really steep decline. That's about, I think, about 75% decline in the number of children served. Again, I'm going to stress what these numbers are representing here. If you look at a similar program that was, or a companion program that was cut at about the same time as TANF, which is child care assistance, you see a similar, pretty sharp decline, not as sharp as TANF, but very sharp. 2011, almost 20,000. And by January of this year, less than 10,000. And this last bullet point here is that, there's correlation out there, but great research done by folks at the School of Social Work and the School of Economics at the University of Kansas tries to tease out whether there's a causal relationship here. I won't try to represent their research, but I recommend it to folks to see how they looked at the degree that it might just be coincidence or correlation, and how much of it is really, we cut TANF, we increase child neglect and abuse. So again, very complex system. Do not want to oversimplify, and at the same time, there's a pretty, in my mind, convincing body of research that suggests this is a large contributing factor, and if we really want to address the foster care crisis and do it in a fiscally responsible way, restoring access to TANF, again, these are federal dollars that are just, at this point, sitting in a bank because they come in a block grant, is likely to have a really great, it feels strange to say return on investment when we're talking about kids, but that's the sort of idea, right? That this is money that's available that could really help us dig down into the root causes of the foster care crisis. Let me really buzz through this. So the second goal is around stability of environment. Looking at the metrics there, again, not good. So the state federal standard is that a child who's in foster care won't experience more than 4 different placements within 1,000 days. Here in Kansas in this past fiscal year, our average was more than double that. So on average, 9 placements per 1,000 days. And again, that's the average. We know that there are some kids who are pinballing around, literally spending one night here, one night there, one night there. So some kids are facing extreme placement instability, which obviously very traumatizing for the kid, sets them up for significant long-term negative effects. When you look similarly at education continuity, the standard here is actually, I think, remarkably low in terms of what we expect, which is just that 25%, 1 in 4, attend the same school that they did before. But in Kansas, we're considerably lower than that, about 16%. And you know, instinctually, those two are connected, right? If you have a kid moving around a lot, it's going to be hard for them to stay in the same school. Again, as I keep stressing, complex. One thing that folks have pointed out is the use of kin care, so placing a child with a family or known non-relative person, rather than moving them into an unknown foster home. In terms of what's happening here in Saline County, it looks a little bit different actually than the picture statewide, in that kin placement is actually less commonly used here in Saline County. Group residential is slightly more used, and foster family homes are slightly more used. So as you pointed out, there's a big disparity between licensed foster homes who are not related or not known to the child, who are getting about $21 a day, and those kin placements who are getting $3 a day. There's been an effort to increase this, but it's difficult when the contract's already set, and St. Francis, KBC have a certain amount of money, you know, to increase the amount that they're able to provide to them. A lot could be said about what's happening with kids moving around so much. We know that there's not a sufficient array of homes for kids, especially kids with high needs. There aren't therapeutic foster homes, things that are really important. And so as a result, kids are bouncing around. One potential improvement is to increase placements in kin care and support for that. But again, that is not going to address it. There is a significant shortage. It's an inadequate array currently of foster home placements to match the specific needs of kids in the foster care system. And then finally, with the third goal around permanency, again, not a great picture. The average amount of time, if the child is reunified, and by reunified again, we mean placed back with their birth families, the issues having been resolved. That takes on average 10 months. Adoption, on average, takes more than 3 years, 38 months. And kids who age out of the system, The number is around the same as adoption. I think it's actually maybe on average 36 months that child who is aged out has been in foster care. As I said, we've been traveling around the state. From that, we've been hearing anecdotally, and actually there is some data to back up some of the, or to confirm some of these anecdotes. But what we've heard from practitioners and families is that services aren't there to make reunification a realistic possibility. High caseloads, again, this is not anecdotal. There's now very specific numbers coming out of DCF with some investigator positions having 50. I think the best practice is 12 or 14 cases at a time. So when you've got a caseload of 50, I mean, just to state the obvious, right, something's going to fall through the cracks, and that's going to be kids and their safety and their well-being. We also hear from social workers that is a large contributor to burnout. We know there's incredibly high turnover in these positions, and a large part of that is driven by extremely high caseloads. I mean, 50 kids on average, so there are some who are having higher caseloads. And again, going back to the lack of a sufficient array of placements, we hear a lot about high acuity youth, kids with high needs, that there not being any appropriate placement for them. And so some of those kids are the ones who are bounced around the most. One of the contributing factors here has to do with kids staying for a very long time and reunification often not being a realistic possibility because of the lack of resources. And then the high caseload being both dangerous for the kids as well as the workers and the system as a whole. So if we're going to address this, we need to lower caseloads, make more resources available for reunification or adoption, make sure that our array of placements is adequate to meet the needs of kids. So just to recap, again, federally, states are charged with providing for the safety, permanency, and well-being of kids in the child welfare system. Here in Kansas, we've also articulated 3 very specific goals around helping families early when they start struggling, providing stable environments, and providing permanency as quickly as possible and effectively as possible. We talked about metrics. We've got a long way to go. We probably won't have time to talk through these, but I actually think we've touched on a lot of them already in our conversation today. But these are the questions that we've been asking across the state, again, in those community forums now in 5 communities. Really trying to understand from communities themselves, because I do think that communities are in an excellent position to speak to these issues because you know these kids, you know these families, you know what services are available. But we're trying to find out from folks about what can Kansas do to address this. We know it's a big problem. We know it's a very urgent problem, and it's going to take all of us.
If you want to stay and talk to Bennett, I'm sure you can stay a few more minutes. But thank you all for being here, and register to vote by October 16th, and don't forget to vote in November. Thank you very much.